On the morning of the 15th of June 2005, a team of paramedics was called to the Holy Trinity Monastery of Tanacu, a remote location situated between the hills and forests of Eastern Romania. Upon arrival, the paramedics found what appeared to be the lifeless body of a young woman, dressed as a nun and laid on a makeshift cross. Her name was Irina Cornici, and she was only 23 years old. And unbeknownst to the paramedics, she had just been through a 3-day-long exorcism in which Father Daniel Corogeanu, assisted by 4 nuns, attempted to deliver her from evil. For, according to Mother Superior Nionila Nicoletta Arculiano, Irina had a behavior similar to those demonized from the time of the Savior. Those people were trembling, gnashing their teeth, writhing on the floor. They broke their chains, threw themselves into fire and water, and no one could approach them. That's what Irina did during religious services. She trembled, screamed, struggled, jerked. The Holy Fathers say that first man should examine himself, and only then take the Holy Sacrament of Communion. She did not disclose everything during her confession, and took the Holy Sacrament unworthily. Examining her body, the paramedics detected the signs of irreversible death. Even so, overwhelmed by the fear of God and the insistence of the nuns that Irina was alive when they called the ambulance, they tried to revive her and carried her to the hospital, marking the beginning of what would become one of the most outraging and highly publicized cases of exorcism in the 21st century. Before we explore this case, please allow a brief interlude for me to discuss the sponsor of today's video, HelloFresh. I am a big foodie. Healthy eating and fresh quality produce are big parts of my daily life. When you stop to think about it, it's simply incredible how much time we dedicate to food preparation and eating. I've always wanted to find a way to cut down the amount of time it, for lack of a better word, eats from my schedule, but without sacrificing quality. And so I'm pleased to share with you HelloFresh, a meal kit provider that I've been using for some time now, that has truly cut down the amount of time I spend designing, shopping for, and preparing meals. HelloFresh delivers fresh quality produce from the farm to your door in less than a week. More than that, the food is effortlessly arranged into delicious meals with pre-measured ingredients and simple-to-follow recipe cards. And that's not to say that these meal kits erase the fun of cooking. Far from it. HelloFresh is an experience all in itself. Before using these meal kits, I thought I was quite a competent cook, but I've discovered many new recipes and techniques, learning something new with each box. With the weekly recipes that you are able to choose from offering a wide variety of flavors and cuisines, meaning that you are never more than a click away from discovering something new. My husband Eric and I love to cook together, and we've really enjoyed how it caters to our needs, absolutely. We don't need to go to the supermarket so often, and can even skip a week if we are not going to be at home. The best thing for me personally, however, is how HelloFresh is inclusive of all dietary requirements and preferences. Eric and I are pescatarian, and we are never left wanting. In particular, I recently enjoyed cooking pesto-crusted sea bass, which was as delicious as it sounds, being served with a delightful butter sauce. This meal, by the way, was one of their calorie-smart offerings, something which I never would have guessed from the flavour. So HelloFresh makes it easy to eat well and reach your health goals, without sacrificing enjoyment. If this sounds like something of interest to you, and given the footage of food that I've been cooking that is on screen now, I cannot imagine how it isn't. HelloFresh is offering my viewers an extremely generous 16 free meals across 7 boxes, plus 3 free gifts. Simply go to HelloFresh.com and use Paranormal Scholar 16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. That's Paranormal Scholar 16 at HelloFresh.com, with my exclusive link being clickable in the description. Bon appetit. Thank you. Now on with the video. The exorcism at Tanacu is nothing short of terrifying. However, for Irina Cornici, it was only the last fight in a long string of battles with oppression, abuse, and inner demons. Irina was born in 1981 in poverty to an unmarried couple from Vaslui County in Eastern Romania. In 1984, at only 3 years old, Irina is said to have witnessed her father, a brawler with unstable behavior, hanging himself from the beam of the house. With her father gone, her mother was deemed financially unfit to care for her and her 2 siblings, and so a decision was made to leave her and her younger brother Vasile in the care of the state. Irina and her brother grew up in one of the most corrupt orphanages of the time. There they suffered unspeakable abuse at the hands of those entrusted to be their caregivers. But by all accounts, Irina's physical and psychological development was deemed normal for the type of environment that she grew up in. Like many girls raised in Romanian orphanages at the time, she was tough, wary of men, and hard-working. While in the system, she took self-defense classes and developed a passion for karate, often using her skills to protect her friends. Likewise, she spoke with a deeper, more intimidating voice and only felt comfortable dressed in sportswear. Her upbringing and limited education gave her few options for the future, and so in 2001 she sought employment in Germany, where she worked as a maid and a nanny. While there, Irina kept in close touch with her brother and her best friend from the orphanage, Paraskiva Angel. Wanting to escape their tumultuous past at the orphanage and the hardships of the outside world, Paraskiva joined the Order of the Holy Trinity at the Monastery of Tanacu in 2003. In her letters to Irina, Sister Paraskiva wrote that the abbot of the monastery, Father Daniel Corogeanu, was a great man, and that after confessing her sins to him, she was peaceful and relieved. Promising that it would bring her soul much-needed ease, she invited Irina to the monastery for confession and Holy Communion. And so, at the beginning of April 2005, Irina and her brother visited Sister Paraskiva, intending to be there only for a short while, as she made plans to return to Germany in June. For Father Daniel, the visit was a godsend. With the abbey still under construction and much yard work to be done, he counted on their help at the monastery. After all, he had only started building it in the year 2000. The same year, he had been hastily and controversially ordained to the priesthood before finishing his theological studies, with it claimed that he failed to attend his examinations on multiple occasions, and was even repeatedly expelled by his university. This unusual decision defied the law of the Orthodox Church, which states that to be endowed with the Holy Sacrament of Ordination, one must be a graduate of a theological school. Nevertheless, controversial or not, Father Daniel was ordained, and with the Holy Sacrament was granted the authority to perform exorcisms. Indeed, it was his duty and sanctifying mission to do so. After all, unlike in Catholicism, exorcisms in the Orthodox Church can be conducted without seeking approval from higher-ranking clergy, with the decision left to the discretion of the individual priest. The service of exorcism is thus performed by every bishop or priest. In Eastern Romania, exorcisms of those troubled by evil spirits are habitually performed en masse during service. And although the Orthodox Church frowns upon such public exorcisms, the priests who perform them are oftentimes revered as religious celebrities. Inspired by the reputation of such priests, Father Daniel began performing his own devil-banishing services at Tanacu, although not to the same extent as his elders. After all, at 29 years old, he was still young, and in the 5 years since he became a priest, his time was split between building the church, managing the abbey, and preaching to parishioners. A challenging task, considering that he believed the dangers of Freemasonry and Western inventions were lurking inside the younger hierarchy of the Orthodox Church. His rather extreme views were only reinforced by the constant refusal of the county bishop to bless the church at the monastery. The bishop wanted conventional iconography to be painted on the walls. Father Daniel disagreed and considered his blessing little more than a formality. As such, he continued to hold his service inside the church for his parishioners, nuns, and now his new guest, Irina. Upon arrival at the monastery, Irina was elated to be reunited with Sister Paraskiva and spent the following days reminiscing, helping with chores and attending service. Seeing that life at the monastery provided a sense of safety and stability, and that her best friend's life had been improved by taking her religious vows, Irina is reported to have started toying with the idea of staying there. Pressured by her friend, yet still unsure what to do, Irina decided to confess her sins on the 8th of April. Mindful of the trauma that she may carry, Father Daniel helped her ease into the confession, asking her at first about her life in Germany. However, as soon as she exhausted the topic, she is said to have become distressed, seeming to retreat inside herself. Seeing her lost in her thoughts, Father Daniel then proceeded to advise her to leave the West behind, suggesting that she use her savings to buy a home near the monastery, so as to be close to the holiness of God. After she passively replied to a few more questions, he gave her his blessing and penance, which she promised to complete before the Holy Communion. And so, early the next morning, she joined the sisters at Mass, eagerly awaiting to receive the Holy Communion. Although uncomfortable abandoning her usual clothes, Irina wore a skirt and covered her head, a conventionality which brought much joy to the sisters and Father Daniel. After the communion, she is claimed to have felt as though something had changed inside of her. She felt light, and the other nuns could see her stepping gently and almost hesitantly as she walked in the yard that afternoon. Uplifted, she began humming a song to herself, which, according to her later descriptions, filled her being. She is said to have heard the voices in the song melting into each other as her heartbeat grew stronger. At first, the pulse was sparse and heavy, then it sped up, accelerating and ascending to her ears and carrying her as if by flight towards the door of the church. Unbeknownst to her, the sisters were beginning the evening prayers early, so they were beating the semantron in a similar rhythm at the same time that Irina had this experience. The semantron is an ancient percussion instrument, one which is regarded by the church as more than a mere cultural creation. Rather, when included in a liturgical act, such as summoning to prayer or procession, it is a way of elevating man to God. The song of the semantron makes the connection between earth and heaven, mankind and divinity, and what is known and unknown. It is uncertain whether Irina was aware of the religious meaning of this instrument, but the experience and the events that follow are truly mystifying and unsettling. After all, although she felt pulled towards the church by the divine sound, Irina resisted. Grounding herself, she became increasingly troubled by the skirt that she was wearing, her feeling so much more comfortable and safe in her usual sportswear. And so she turned to leave, only to be stopped by some of the sisters who needed help with yard work. Irritated, Irina told them to take care of it themselves, as it was their monastery and not hers. It is then that Mother Neonila supposedly attempted to appease her. Irina, however, began mumbling and continued to walk away. As soon as the Mother Superior turned her attention from her, Irina is said to have snuck behind her back, making rude remarks and mimicking obscene gestures. Dumbfounded, Mother Neonila summoned Sister Paraskiva, which made Irina flee. After the evening service concluded, she returned to the church entrance, now dressed in jeans. And her clothes were not the only thing to have changed. Supposedly, she rushed towards the sisters, hopping behind them, sometimes mimicking their walks, yelling profanities at them. Sister Paraskiva claimed that despite having been inseparable since they were children, she no longer recognized her friend. What unsettled her most of all, however, was how, when she said Jesus' name, Irina reacted badly. Upon seeing his guest's behavior, Father Daniel concluded that she must have kept something from him during confession, which had thus compromised her Holy Communion. And so, concerned for his penitent, he asked Sister Paraskiva to bring Irina to him for a second confession, and for her to support her through the process. This did not go as planned. Indeed, in a rather unusual twist that defies the very concept of confession, Sister Paraskiva decided to confess Irina's sins for her. As her friend divulged the concealed and traumatic parts of her life, Irina is said to have grown highly distressed, mimicking her and nodding dramatically in affirmation. At the end of the confession, Father Daniel prayed over them, to no avail. Irina's behavior became increasingly more disturbed, escalating until, when exiting the confessional, she dropped to the ground and began squirming, 1 minute yelling that she wanted to leave the abbey, and the next pleading with God and the nuns to let her stay. Shocked by what they were seeing and fearful for her, Father Daniel and Mother Neonila decided to drive her to the hospital. Irina, however, resisted and fought the nuns as they tried to get her into the car. Free of them, she headed for the barbed wire fence of the monastery. Stumbling, she rolled downhill and, as later reports from those present at the monastery attest, began growling and digging her face in the dirt. By now terrified, Mother Neonila called for an ambulance, asking them to come and sedate her. Describing the experience later, Irina supposedly heard Mother Neonila's words as if through a funnel. Not merely that, the Mother Superior's hands elongated before her and grew claws as her eyes enlarged and her mouth opened as if to swallow her. Trapped in this horrific vision, she dug her head back into the dirt, cursing the monastery, the saints, and even the wax of the candles in the chapel. All the while, the dispatcher did not take the calls seriously, with Sister Anastasia, a nun with basic medical training, placing another call so as to explain the situation herself. Once again, the dispatcher denied them help, being said to have instead sarcastically suggested that they should pray over Irina, since they were already at the monastery. Defeated, Father Daniel and Mother Neonila took a rope from a nearby fountain and tied Irina's hands and feet together behind her back, immobilizing her. And so it was like this that they drove her to the Vaslui County Hospital, where she was sedated and admitted into intensive care. There, one of the nurses is said to have turned to Mother Neonila and made a remark which stayed with her long afterwards. What Irina was suffering from was obvious and could only be treated at the monastery. Meanwhile, Irina was diagnosed with delusional hallucinatory flush, exhibiting psychomotor agitation and onset of major psychosis. She was later transferred to the psychiatric ward, where, due to her violent outbursts, she had to be restrained and kept under medicated sleep. There, Irina was diagnosed with disorganized schizophrenia, which, by all medical accounts, was an excessive diagnosis meant only to facilitate the prescription of antipsychotic medication. After 4 days on such medication, Irina's health worsened, with the antipsychotics themselves thought to have been the cause. And so she was transferred once again to intensive care, where it was concluded that her health was critical. Irina remained under medical supervision until the 20th of April, some 12 days after her initial confession. Mother Neonila and Sister Paraskiva paid her regular visits, during which they claimed to have noticed her increased aversion to religious iconography, stating that it would harm her. Even so, Irina told them that she wanted to return to the monastery, repeatedly asking them not to leave her at the hospital. According to reports, she also told the doctors that she heard voices before coming to the hospital. They were demonic, and they were telling me what to do, and that I sinned in my thoughts. I want to go home. And so, although she was still recovering, she was deemed communicative without psychotic disassociation. The auditory hallucinations and mystical delirium that she experienced, she was able to recognize. Thus, happy enough, the doctors at the hospital released Irina into the care of Mother Neonila. At the monastery, Irina was placed under the supervision of Sister Anastasia. While supervising her, it was clear to the sister that Irina was not recovered. She is said to have witnessed her screaming, singing, and rocking back and forth at the edge of her bed with a blank stare on her face. She later stated that she was certain that Irina was possessed because she felt the shivers of hell in her presence. And yet, Irina wanted to confess and receive Holy Communion again. Instead of immediately indulging her, however, Father Daniel asked Sister Anastasia to help her prepare. And so, when she was ready, Irina confessed her sins to Father Daniel and completed her penance. Then, on the 1st of May, she received Holy Communion during Easter service. Immediately after, the sisters claimed that Irina began showing them her true being. She helped in the kitchen, joined the choir, and by all accounts was as good as new. The confession, so it seemed, had worked. And yet other reports state that she would start crying and leave the church at key moments during service. Supposedly inspired by seeing her progress, Father Daniel told Irina that they could continue to take care of her at the monastery, but that they would need more resources for her medication and accommodation. As such, he asked her to yield her savings to the church, something which she did, but at great cost to herself. After all, as she did so, Irina realized that a big part of her savings was already spent. Thus, she became highly distressed and started fasting and praying for God to help her recover the money. Between the 6th and 9th of June, her condition worsened. Although she was not violent, she spoke incoherently and had what can only be described as bizarre reactions. Namely, during the Ascension service on the 9th of June, Irina began laughing hysterically. That same evening, she sang lullabies as she slammed her bed into the walls. Around 4 a.m., with Irina still in her frenzy, Sister Anastasia is claimed to have called Father Daniel to pray over her. Although the prayer calmed Irina, who drifted to sleep, Father Daniel was fearful that she may wake up and leave the chamber, and so he locked her in. The next day, Irina was let out for a walk, but her behavior had not improved. She yelled, cursed, danced, and threatened the nuns who approached her with karate moves, even hurting one of them. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate, and so she was confined to her chamber once again. Not only that, Father Daniel and Mother Neonila concluded that Irina was now too dangerous, and that she needed to be tied and gagged so as not to disturb the service. Using a wrestling move that he knew from high school, Father Daniel subdued her as she transitioned from cursing to singing. He then requested Mother Neonila, Sister Anastasia, and 2 others to watch over her and maintain the peace. For the next 2 days, the nuns kept Irina confined to her chamber. tied and gagged with a towel. When they tried to feed her, she refused to eat, instead yelling and screaming that the devil had come to take her. It was at this point that Father Daniel decided to transfer Irina inside the church to conduct an exorcism. To carry her and keep her immobilized during the ritual, the nuns tied her to a makeshift stretcher. They took 3 boards from the construction site and placed 2 of them side by side and the third perpendicular to the other 2, resulting in a T-shaped cross. Thus, on the 13th of June, they tied Irina to this makeshift cross, using chains secured with locks on her hands, feet and waist, and taped her mouth with bandages that were secured around her head. They would not allow the devil to make her move. During the exorcism, Father Daniel read the prayers of Saint Basil and offered the sacrament of Holy Unction to an increasingly agitated Irina. Her muffled screams are described as having become louder during the prayers of Saint Basil, enforcing Father Daniel's belief that she was indeed possessed by the devil. Furthermore, she refused to take the holy water and bread which he offered her. After hours of relentless struggle, Irina was carried to the enclosed veranda of the church and placed on a quilt, still tied to the makeshift cross. There she was left. That night, one of the sisters is said to have heard her scream, "I am Christ, come to me, for I have been to hell. I am Christ, here at Tanacu." The next day was the same. Still tied to the cross, Irina struggled and trembled during the exorcism, and was restless when moved to the veranda. She could not sleep or drink the water offered to her, and she supposedly started foaming at the mouth, which was now an open wound. On the morning of the 15th of June, determined that he was doing God's work, Father Daniel prepared to drive the devil from Irina one more time. By all accounts, Irina was calmer, although she was anxious and spoke with a weak voice. In the absence of Mother Neonila, Sister Anastasia and her 2 companions decided to untie her before the exorcism, as she was stiff from being on the makeshift cross for so long. Free of her chains, Irina was feeble. She could not stand on her feet. Sister Anastasia tried to feed her bread soaked in warm tea, but soon Irina became unresponsive. Father Daniel was alerted that Irina was barely breathing and that her face had changed. After listening to her pulse with a stethoscope, Sister Anastasia concluded that they needed to call for an ambulance. After the paramedics were called, the sisters prepared Irina for the hospital, as they hadn't changed her clothes in 3 days. While they washed and changed her, Irina was limp and quiet. They dressed her in a black skirt and blouse and covered her head as if she were one of them. When the paramedics arrived nearly 30 minutes later, Father Daniel informed them that Irina was no longer breathing and had no pulse. After examining the body, they concluded that Irina must have died a few hours before they arrived. This was a conclusion that Father Daniel and the sisters refuted. They had given her tea and bread to eat only an hour earlier. It was not possible. And so, despite their initial conclusion, it seems as though the paramedics became overwhelmed by the situation, with them attempting resuscitation as they drove Irina to the hospital. They injected her, according to procedure, with adrenaline every 5 minutes. At the hospital, it was once again concluded that Irina had been deceased for a few hours. According to the doctor who examined her, her injuries and intense dehydration made her body appear like that of a 60-year-old woman. And so the authorities were notified that a 23-year-old nun had died by violence at the Tanacu Monastery, after which a criminal investigation began. Only a few days later, Father Daniel led Irina to her final rest, presiding over her funeral on the 20th of June. 2 days after that, he and the 4 nuns who assisted him in the exorcism were arrested by local authorities, and excommunicated by the Orthodox Church the very next day. They were shocked, both at the time and in the time since. Irina could not have died by their hands, and so they maintained their innocence, with Father Daniel even stating on national television that he would have had a guilty conscience if she had died during the exorcisms. Despite this, in a press release from the 7th of July, long before the criminal investigation and medical report were concluded, the Patriarchate declared that Irina had died as a result of the inhumane treatments she was subjected to at the monastery, stating that the exorcism, i.e. the suite of prayers to expel unclean spirits, is part of the doctrine and practice of the Universal Church, based on the Holy Scriptures, and consists exclusively of prayers accompanied by sprinkling holy water and anointment with holy oil. Any acts or procedures other than these, of the nature of those used at Tanacu, constitute serious deviations from church discipline. In short, they wash their hands of everything that took place at the monastery. The investigation and trial that followed were arduous. In an attempt to argue that Irina's death was caused by the adrenaline shots given to her in the ambulance and not the exorcism, her body was even exhumed. Still, the medical examiner concluded that the cause of death was hypovolemic shock with multi-organ failure due to severe dehydration caused by prolonged fluid restriction and aggravated by the psychomotor agitation of the victim. The exorcism, led by Father Daniel, had ended her life. When asked why they had crucified Irina on the makeshift cross, the nuns explained to the investigators that it was just a stretcher and not a cross. They had simply needed to carry and immobilize her. Defiant of any wrong that they had done, the nuns even insisted that no cross shaped like that existed, even though the T-shaped cross is one of the 4 basic types of representations of the cross, otherwise known as the Tau or St. Anthony's cross. How the nuns, one of whom was a Mother Superior, a nun of 14 years, did not know this is unfathomable, and so one can only assume that they were either incredibly uneducated and thus in no position to attempt any measure of spiritual intervention, or that there was a much more sinister side to the happenings at Tanacu. They had crucified Irina intentionally. As such, on the 20th of September 2007, Daniel Corogeanu and the 4 excommunicated nuns were found guilty of deprivation of liberty resulting in death, and were sentenced to prison terms between 5 and 7 years. By 2011, all were released from prison for good behavior. Today, there are still many who believe that Irina died from an adrenaline overdose, and not because of the exorcism. After all, Father Daniel and the nuns have always maintained their innocence, with Father Daniel even preaching that God would punish the non-believers during a televised interview. That one of the prosecutors died during the trial has done little to erode support for the father and the nuns' actions. And yet, undoubtedly, this case is a tragedy, with the reality as to whether or not Irina was demonically possessed being somewhat secondary to the happenings at Tanacu. Despite all of their protestations, the nuns and priests crucified a 23-year-old woman. Tied to a cross, Irina was left to suffer until her eventual death. Her rapidly deteriorating health, both mental and physical, made worse by the local hospital, disabled her completely and weakened her in her battles, spiritual or otherwise. A fighter her whole life, she thus found herself powerless in her final struggle. Whether that was a struggle against the devil, or the much more earthly, misguided faith of the falsely righteous, or some dreadful and deplorable mixture of the two, we may never know. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you also to my dear friend Radiana, whom some of you may recall from my documentary In Search of the Dead, who did such a wonderful job researching and writing this script. And so if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more of the paranormal if you are not already, or of course consider watching another as suggested on screen now. Thank you. Until next time.